Good. I hope you've all recharged your batteries and things. One of the most pleasant tasks I have today is to present the award of honorary membership of the NBN, which we try and do every year. And this year it's with great pleasure that the NBN Award for Honorary Membership is going to be given to Dr. Stuart Ball. Stuart has the special combination of quantitative skills, programming expertise, and a deep understanding of natural history. And these have been fundamental to the way he's supported and developed biological recording over the past 25 years. And this in turn has contributed significantly to the overall success of the NBN. And I'd like to highlight in particular three contributions that Stuart has made. First, Stuart has carried out pioneering work in developing and maintaining a data management system specifically designed for biological recording. This began as early as 1984 when he demonstrated a package he was developing for his own recording, and that was taken up subsequently and developed into a standard package, especially for amateur recorders and LRCs, and this in turn grew into the whole recorder project, which has served as a model for biological recording systems for more than 20 years, and now in its latest reincarnation is Recorder 6. Second thing I'd like to highlight is Stuart's contribution to diptera recording in general, and particular since 1990 in running the hoverfly recording scheme jointly with Roger Morris. This has proved to be a model for how a scheme for a moderately difficult group could be made popular and effective by communicating with recorders and providing training level at all levels, from beginners to improving experts. Their provisional atlas in 2000 was an excellent example of what can be done with data from a recording scheme, and this atlas has now been updated in 2011. And then finally, Stuart's work on the analysis and interpretation of recording scheme data has been highly influential in stimulating the wider use of biological recording data for measuring trends. In particular, he's led the way by developing techniques to analyze the hoverfly recording scheme and ways to illustrate the impacts of climate change and habitat loss. So it's with great pleasure I'll ask Stuart to come forward. And we've got a pose for the camera, Stuart, so put on your best smile.
Very much.
The second pleasurable task I have is to introduce this year's Sir John Burnett Memorial Lecture, which is given this year by Professor Bill Sutherland from the Department of Zoology at Cambridge. Bill holds the Miriam Rothschild Chair of Conservation Biology, and his research involves applying ecological data and models to understanding conservation problems. And he is currently heavily involved in exploring a range of ways of integrating conservation science and policy, especially through the development of evidence-based conservation. He has written two very influential books on the Conservation Handbook and an absolute classic, From Individual Behavior to Population Biology. And he is currently the president of the British Ecological Society. So I'd like to welcome Bill, and his talk is entitled Big Data, NBN and Effective Conservation. Sorry? Pointer? What does the pointer look like, Jim?
It's okay.
Well,
I'm managed with that. That's right.
ah,
A black thing. Okay. Thank you. So, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be part of this conference talking about future challenges. And what I thought I'd do is I'd talk about monitoring, briefly how monitoring has changed and how monitoring could change in the future, and how, what different ways there are of using the data that NBN and the like have. So, of course, we start off with Linnaeus. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Linnaeus with his way of naming species. And of course, he was a great collector. You can see his beloved twin flower. And collecting was a large part of identifying species, even in ornithology, which to me seems to have problems. Here's Richard Meinertzhagen. Once you've caught one Cory bustard, I'm not quite sure how you then catch another one and take them all back, but it seems quite difficult. And then we have photography. Here are the great Kearton brothers, Richard and Cherry Kearton. That means you can document photos. They also invented the idea of using skins as hides so you could get close to the birds. It's quite a good system. It's actually portable. I then started wondering, it's a real pity that this stopped. I was wondering what twitching would be like nowadays and what the East Bank would look like if they were all doing that. And this also has other problems. And then we have the field guides, and I know keys are often the essential way of working, but field guides for a lot of areas are critical. And this is, when I was very young, I went to our local park, and I saw one of these, and I thought, my brother has a field guide, and I went and looked it up, and I've never come across another field guide that has Chinese goose or swan goose in it, but that had it, and I thought, that's pretty cool. And I think that might be why I took up bird watching. So if it wasn't for that book, I mightn't be here today. And then, of course, the Roger Toy Peterson series with its way of identifying and producing little arrows. It's revolutionized the subject. It's very interesting to see as areas like moths and dragonflies and whales have changed as really good field guides have come into place. Now, I think in a few years' time, we'll look back at this sort of slide and wonder and say, were we really that hopeless? You know, if I saw a bird, I'd then look at it through my binoculars, and then if I wanted to, I'd then get out my telescope and look at that, and if I thought it was good, I'll then get my camera out and photograph that, and then take that chip home to my computer and send it round to people, or get my iPod out and fix it to there for digiscoping. You know, it's a very old-fashioned way of doing it. If you think of what's going to happen, you think of Google Spectacles, you think of the way in which the technology is going to change. All of this is going to be integrated in a couple of years' time. We're going to automatically video everything we're seeing down our binoculars. All of these will become one bit of kit, I think, rather than lots of different bits of kit. And we've talked about applications. And we're sort of moving towards making it easier. I've got a huge pile of field guides. Soon we're going to get rid of all that pile of field guides. It's all going to be digital. I'm sure of that. But I think, as someone said earlier, these apps are a pretty unsatisfactory way of doing it. I suspect many of you may know of Discover Life. It's a multi-access key, but it seems to me it very much shows the future for a lot of identification type problems. If you look at the classic key, there's one key I've come across, the botanical key. Question one is it an annual or perennial? You have to be kind of patient to find out. So these multi-access keys means that you don't have to answer all the questions. So here is, this is ants of North America, done because E.O. Olson wanted it. And I've just invented this. I didn't actually have an ant with me, but I imagined I couldn't actually tell whether or not it was too close or too stalked. That seems very fiddly. I could count it had 10 segments. I knew it had 2 thoraxes, but it seemed a bit sort of browny black, so I'm not really sure which one of those it was. So I do that, and then I press search, and then I press the simplify button, and this is where it gets clever. It says, for those species remaining, which are the most useful questions for you to answer. And it then says, you might actually be a serious ant taxonomist, in which case you might know the genus and the family, which I'm not. You might know the waist PTL numbers, but I'm not sure about that. It's got wing scars, I'm not really sure what wing scars are. It's got an antenna socket at the lip. Well, actually, I can see from that picture, yes, it does. I'll tick that one. It'll then tell me what it is. So these multi-access keys mean that you can put in whatever bits of information you've got, which seems to me to overcome the massive problems that we normally have with keys. Jonathan Silverdowns insisted I put this in. Actually, I pleaded for him to include it in. It's a very nice example. I'm sure you all know iSpot. iSpot is a...
Sorry to interrupt. Can you stay by the lectern? No, I see
Okay, I'll tie my shoelaces here. That's no problem at all. I'll get some wet concrete and stand at it. So iSpot, as I'm sure you know, you put up your photos, and then other people comment on the identification, and they're very clever ways of assigning how expert different people are, and then that gives you some sort of level of confirmation. So this person said, some children in Zululand, and there's a South African part to iSpot, some children in Zululand have eaten these seeds and are ill. I'd like an ID if possible. There's kind of a bit of an urgency. And then 35 seconds later, someone says, hey, this is what it seems to be, and a couple of people seem to agree, and then the doctor said, thanks very much, that's great, that was really useful. And that's just a very nice example of the power of this sort of process. And then, funded partly by the British Ecological Society, I'm pleased to say, there's also, you can then use that to go beyond the identification to learn something about the ecology. They've been putting together the webs of which Lepidoptera feed on which tree species, and you can then start having much more sophisticated information rather than just the simple identification. So you can say, I've got this black poplar, and you can then tell you which species occur on that. Getting even more sophisticated, you can now use increased technology for collecting calls, for back calls. And here's some slides I stole from Kate Jones. I've just stolen slides from people. It's very easy giving a talk. Don't know why there's a fuss. Kate Jones sent me these slides. And she's got this program, iBats, where you can then record back calls. And increasingly, if you think of iPhones, think of mobile phones that record the time and the date and the GPS, all this sort of information. And increasingly you have species recognition, you have voice recognition software, which is actually quite good for bats. Lots of people are trying it for birds. And increasingly we're having image recognition. People have been doing it for plants, but presumably we'll have it for all sorts of other taxa too. Which then raises the interesting issue, how much species recognition do we want? If we had something that would identify birds for us when we looked at it through our binoculars, would we actually want that or not? It's kind of interesting thing I see some shaking of heads, but an interesting thing to think about as to what we would or wouldn't want. And we were discussing with the sort of like Google glasses, it could actually find the species and identify it. You might actually be asleep at the time, and presumably when you'd wake up, it would say, you know, a golden eagle's just flown past. But it sounds fanciful, but this technology is moving so fast that it's quite remarkable what's happening. So automatic identification is going to be commonplace, I think. And this is just an example of how it's going. So they can get people to go out. They needn't necessarily be experts. Just go out and record it, download all that information, have automated recognition, massively improve the amount of species, the species distribution data. And then, just to push it even further, this is Christian Rölz's nice work, in which he fits these little cameras onto birds so he can then get exact data of what they're doing. My daughter have this expression, TMI, too much information. I think this might be the case here. This shows between its legs as exactly what the bird is doing, what it's feeding on, who it's mating with, everything it has, you can then see because it's recorded with a camera. Just think of what that's going to open up to us in the future. Now going to being even cleverer still, there's the DNA, you're sloughing DNA all the time, and that DNA actually lasts a reasonable amount of time in the environment. And so by taking water samples, you can then identify species presence. And this is very useful for invasive species. So it's been used for bluegill sunfish in Japan, for American bullfrogs in Europe, particularly a famous case for the Asian carp in the Great Lakes. For looking at, to see if there's a few present in a lake is a bit of a nightmare to sort of try and sample them or fish them, but here you can take water samples and look for the DNA. Taking this even further, there's a process called meta-barcoding. You probably all know about barcodes. Barcodes are bits of DNA that are readily identifiable, and the idea there is that you can take a sample off clip a butterfly's wing in the field, and it will then identify the species by looking at the DNA barcode that it has and tell you what it is in the field. That's something that people are seriously talking about. Meta-barcoding means you just do this for all the species around. So you just collect a great bunch of species, you just go and sweep out whatever you can find, and then it'll tell you what species are present. So if you're field workers, I've got great news for you. In the future, you're only going to need 2 bits of fieldwork kit. One's going to be something like this, and the other's going to be something like that. And then you just send it off to the labs, and none of that fussing around with keys or anything like that. It's all going to be very easy for you. So, the point I'm making is that there's a huge revolutionary change in the sort of data, the ease of data, the detail of the data, the behavioral data, the genetic data, all this sort of thing. There's going to be this great flood of data that's going to come up. And what are we going to do with that? And that's what I'd like to talk about now. So one key stage, which lots of people are talking about, is to have a platform. And there are there's a number of competing platforms. It's a bit like the videotape battle as to whose platform is going to win. Everyone says we must have one common platform and it's going to be mine. But imagine, so this is a sort of a way of storing information. And this says, well, let's have our biodiversity data. Let's have our NBN data, which is stored in a particular way that makes it usable. But that you have other data. You have land use data, you have hydrological data, you have climatic data, you have economic data, you have geological data, you have crop production data. You have all of that data in the same form so it can be used at the same time. And once you have that, you then have a series of models, and the models, again, fit to the same data structure, so they can then pull together those different sets of data. And because it's attractive, because all the data is accessible, then more of these models will be available. And because there are other models, because there's an economic model here, I'm going to do my land use model because I can link up to the economic model. And so it will all fit together. That's sort of the dream that lots of people are talking about. And that's, I think, we very much want to think of how that can be achieved and what the best way is of bringing all of this information together. And then that means once you've got that, you can use this you can use it for information. I want to know, how, for the dragonflies in my area, I want to know what records there have been in the last 20 years, because I'm just kind of interested. Then there's a sort of research question that we've heard about through all the lovely butterfly conservation work. And then the policy and practice, as we heard about, if you want to know how bats have changed in your particular area, that sort of thing, you would come in here. So that seems to me what we should be aiming at. Now, there's actually a prototype of this. The prototype is actually a cave in Yugoslavia, which was the first mixing of policy making and data that I'm aware of. And the policy maker was Marshal Tito, who was here during the war, hiding in this cave, running the revolution. And the British Army probably parachuted in a Marine commando who had with him, I don't know whether he actually brought with him or knew of the plant life of the Balkan Peninsula, a photographic study by Tyrrell. If he did bring it with him, it might explain why the Second World War took quite so long to get resolved. Anyway, so this commando and Tito had discussions about the plant life of the Balkan Peninsula. I don't actually think that's why he was flown in, but that's what they ended up doing. And then after the war, Tito was so impressed by this, he ended up setting up a set of national parks. So it's really the same sort of process. It's a cave rather than a computer platform. It's bringing policymakers and data together in order that they can make a difference. So who is the other hero in this? Who was the commando that was brought in? It was Sir John Burnett, who, botanist, and obviously not only was his heroic Second World War story, but he was heavily involved in bringing the NBN up to fruition and making sure it thrived. And I'm delighted to be giving a lecture named after him. So if we want to make a difference, if we want to try to contribute towards maintaining or enhancing biodiversity, what do we need to know? We need to know where is important, where are species, which species are rare, where are they? We need to know how is it changing. We need to know what the threats are. We need to know what we can do about it. And we need to know what's cost effective. So what are people likely to do? How much would it cost to do various things? So NBN is this bit, but you could view NBN in isolation, or what I'd like to do is say, well, why don't we view NBN as just a key part of the whole process and try to find ways of linking them together so that information, conservation, monitoring information and practice sort of lead on from one to another. Seems a bit, I'm going to have a number of apparently random digressions. This is going to be one. This is the Oracle at Delphi. She used to inhale sulfurous fumes and give out peculiar pronouncements, which people used to go and ask her questions, and she would then give statements which people would find rather puzzling and go back and ponder over. I'm not quite sure how useful that is, but people used to go and consult her. For some reason, we have the best way of resolving conflicting information that we have, and it's called the Delphi technique. And we do this quite a lot. So you have a question. A classic question, I think, is the one Steve mentions. Is this particular species of dragonfly declining? And you have the information available, and you have the information that may well be conflicting, and you have a group of experts, each of which you say, by what do you think the percentage change is in this dragonfly species? You then present that. You say, these are the number of people who thought it was increasing, this is the number of people that thought it was decreasing. You can look at that. You don't know who said which, but you know what you thought. And then you have a discussion. And the idea is that if you're an outlier, you should either say, well, actually, I've thought about it and I've heard what people say and I'm going to agree and conform, or you argue your case and you say, well, I think you're all wrong because, from this evidence, there's this really good statistical evidence and it really is quite clearly declining because of the rigor of the analysis. And you argue that sort of thing. And then you keep going round and you keep going round and round, and then until eventually there's stopping movement. And that becomes the group assessment. You don't have to conform, you can still disagree at the end, but you will use that as the final result. And it seems a curious way of doing it, but all the evidence is this is overwhelmingly the best way of resolving conflicting information. It's what I think the dragonfly people should do. Okay, why am I telling you about this? I'm sure you all know about IPBES, new way of pulling together all the information on biodiversity and ecosystem services. We've just been looking at that. In fact, I had a piece out yesterday, a Worldview in Nature, and we've been looking at some of the previous reviews, and we found that the way in which it worked is people could just write what they wanted to write, and it's of variable quality. And because it's such a large piece of work, not all of it has been reviewed in the complete detail you'd hope for. And what we're saying is what they should do is pick a small number of topics. They're thinking of pollinators. Let's look at how pollinators have changed, the main causes for that, and what can be done about that, and just look at all the information and then have a Delphi technique to assess that and use that as your best information. Rather than have a couple of, as the IPCC, you have a couple of thousands of pages of text that I think is not helpful. Now, next thing I'd like to say. You can submit wildlife sightings to NBN. I think NBN should have a target in the medium term that for every wildlife sighting, it writes back to the person confirming the record they've given and describing the other information available on that species in that area. Mike's looking very worried. And I think you should aim to do it within 60 seconds. And I'm serious. So, let's look at some American sports. Let's look at these two bits of writing. Just read these two bits of writing. I can't understand either of them. The difference between these two pieces of writing is that one is written by a human and one is written by a computer. So there are lots of small sports games in the United States where they have lots of data. They know who scored what and who got a 8-yard touchdown and whatever that might be. All of that is stored as data, but it's expensive to send a journalist to actually sit through that match, but they have all the data. So what they do is they have sophisticated packages that turn the data into stories, into narratives. So there are 400,000 accounts written in that way last year. They think there might be 1.5 million this year. Another example, you run a shop. You can get a table of your profits and losses, but no one ever looks at that, they say. But if you convert that into a narrative, saying, this is what happened over the last week, people will then read that. Again, you're taking the data, you're converting it into a narrative through computerized texts, and if you're a big enough company, you can afford to do that. So I found a polecat on the road somewhere in Cambridgeshire. There are not very many polecats. Experts told me it was almost certainly a polecat. So I submitted that to NBN. Dear Bill, thank you very much for submitting your record of an adult female polecat on the 3rd of November at Duxford, Cambridgeshire, grid reference to NBN via. There have been 11 previous records. 3 of the 7 sex have also been females. There have been records all 4 seasons. 5 other records have also been individuals found data on the road. Thank you for contributing to the NBN database. That's what I want. This is what I actually got. Thank you for submitting your records. and I should say I've invented all of that. I don't know if that's true. But what I'm saying is that if you've got these big data sets, it's not unrealistic to think of having computerized texts giving your big garden bird watch, your bird records, all those, your NBN records, and putting it in context and sending it back in an automatic way. So remember the sports things, the information goes out within 30 seconds. And Narrative Science is the company that does this. So Dr. Spock, I was brought up under Dr. Spock, and they said, do you put your child to sleep on his or her front or back? And he says if you put him on the front, on the back, he might vomit. That's a slightly other loopy explanation. So he says it's better to put your child to sleep on his or her back. There's since been a big analysis about a decade ago showing your child is more likely to survive if put to sleep on his or her back. They then said, when did we know the evidence? And the answer is about more than a decade earlier. And you could say, how many children would have lived if we'd have implemented that research when we knew it? And the answer is about 60,000. So it's hard to think of something more important, and yet we knew that evidence and we didn't use it. So that's why we have evidence-based medicine, and we're trying to produce evidence-based conservation. So yeah, I'll run out. So we can do that for... So we're summarizing the evidence. We've done it for bees, for birds, for farmlands, for bats, for amphibians. And this is a list of all the other sets of information we have. So our aim is that for any intervention, that the information will then, it'll summarize all the available literature, so it'll then be accessible when you want it. And that just shows how it works. You can click through and it tells you what all the interventions are. And you can compare this with traditional reviews, and then actually turns out to be better with the one we compared it with. But the most important thing is you can access it immediately and for free, rather than having to do a big review of the literature, which takes a lot of time. So the BTO, as pioneers, have introduced this data onto their bird facts. So if you look at their bird facts information, at the end of that it says, for skylarks, linked from conservation evidence, we've got a clever bit of software which links our sources together. And so if there's information on our database, it goes onto their database, and then means that you can go from looking at the evidence, of looking at the information on species, to what the information is on what you can do about it. And that seems a really good thing to do. Increasingly now, there's a shortage of information around the world. So this shows the GBIF data on biodiversity, its availability, and at the bottom shows where the biodiversity is. You notice there's an almost complete mismatch between the two. So increasingly, I think we want to find ways of ensuring that there's more global data and find ways of achieving that. And part of it, I think, is by finding different ways of collating information, and this is what IPBES is committed to doing, is finding ways of looking at local knowledge and trying to find ways of describing what that local knowledge means, as was described in the dragonfly example. What are their gut feelings? Rather than a gut feeling, actually try to get what the evidence base is. Oh yes, I can remember seeing a lot of these in my childhood here, but I haven't seen them for the last 5 years. Getting that sort of information, and then using a Delphi technique to use that information alongside the existing scientific information, which as we've seen will often be quite thin, and put that together. So, final point, I think there's a lot of things we want to think about. We really want to think about what are our priorities for monitoring. For me, the fact we don't seem to know much about earthworms seems to me crazy. We want to work out what the critical issues, but earthworms for me will be a kind of key one. We're going to, what are the issues in the future? So, for example, when nanotechnology hits us, are we going to have the monitoring in place in order to work out what the consequences are and link that to our biodiversity data? We want to standardize methods as much as we can, then it becomes comparable. We want to monitor effort. We've talked about this a little bit already. Records on their own are great, but without data on effort, it's hard to interpret. The more effort data you have, the better it is. We want to make this global, and we want to find ways for increasing capacity. So, delighted to chat to anyone who wants to look at other ways in which it's going to change, ways of working on a synopsis of change, ways of converting review into practice. And if any of you happen to be rich philanthropists with a checkbook, I'm particularly keen to chat to you. But we're very keen on finding all sorts of different ways of making information used and information making a difference. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was both entertaining and very stimulating. We've got time for one or two questions, if there are any. And I don't see any. So, yes, one. Before you speak, could you get a microphone, because otherwise it's not picked up on the YouTube.
Very much enjoyed your talk. Your comments about multi-entry keys, very appropriate, but we do have to still have some taxonomists who will produce these in the future.
Absolutely, although one of the interesting things about the multi-entry keys is it makes taxonomy much more democratic, because at the moment if you have a standard published key, it's up to that person to produce it, and often that's the work for often sort of 30 years, and then it's fixed. And multi-entry keys, because they work, you can have different people fiddling with different bits. So you could argue that it opens up the taxonomy, but indisputably we need skilled biologists and skilled ecologists there. I won't for a minute pretend that you can't do many of these difficult groups without that level of skill, and it is a serious problem that we're losing them.
Right, before we let Bill escape, it's a great pleasure each year to present to him the Sir John Burnett Memorial Lecture Medal, and I'll ask our patron, the Earl of Selborne, to do the honours with that, please.
You'll know where to stand.
I thought they were going to take a photo.
Right, the next talk is by Paul Wilkinson of the Wildlife Trusts, and his talk is entitled Securing Nature's Recovery, the Knowns, Unknowns and Need to Know. That's the pointer.
God, it feels like on Mastermind. That light is really blinding, actually. Really pleased to be here. My name's Paul Wilkinson. I'm the head of Living Landscapes at the Wildlife Trust. I'm not Donald Rumsfeld. I'd probably describe myself within this audience as a specialist generalist, i.e. I specialise in being very general and not really knowing a huge amount of detail about anything. So what I'm going to say today should be taken within that context. But I'm really delighted to be here because one of the real pleasures of today has been to see pictures of wildlife. And in my day-to-day work in and out of various departments and other meetings, I very rarely get to see as much wildlife in a day as I have today, rather only two-dimensional rather than three. So what I'm going to try and describe today is really how our approach to monitoring and how our approach to gathering data and information on the way in which various species are changing their distribution, etc., is evolving due to really the way in which conservation itself is evolving. So conservation really is evolving to reflect the fact that the strategies that we've had in the past, which still remain relevant to protect particular places for wildlife, protected areas, and to focus on particular protected species, is still critical. But the way in which the landscape is changing, the various pressures and threats to our wildlife are constantly evolving, and the systems that we're working with are constantly evolving as well and are hugely dynamic. And therefore, the way in which conservation manages that change, the way in which we as conservationists and people who care about wildlife try to apply our best available knowledge to try and conserve species in the future, is also changing. And the way in which we gather information, the way in which we analyse and use information, to know whether the interventions that we're making are actually having the blindest bit of difference or not, is also changing. We also, as Barry Gardner mentioned this morning, we've got new language which is entering into our vocabulary around natural capital and biodiversity offsetting. And these themselves bring their own challenges in order to kind of interpret the way in which nature is changing over time, and therefore the value of our natural assets and whether those natural assets are going up or down is a critical part of why we're gathering the information that we are, and the way in which we need to use that to reinterpret those concepts in a way that mean that they become less of a suspicious and threatening language, and more about the way in which we build those into our armoury, of the way in which we build the case for more investment and time invested in nature. So, as a Wildlife Trust, we've for the last 100 years, we celebrated our centenary last year, but been protecting places for nature. And Charles Rothschild, our kind of founding father, if you like, secured his first one of his first places at Woodwalton Fen in Cambridgeshire, as, if you like, one of the first ever nature reserves protecting wild places for nature. But since that time, we've acquired 2,300 nature reserves, as have other organisations like the Wildlife Trust, been protecting these isolated sites from increasing pressures. Am I going to be told I'm stepping in Bill's concrete? No? We've been protecting these isolated sites from increasing pressures. But what we've all recognised is that actually this was an emergency measure. And our hope always was that wildlife, when the time was right, would actually re-emerge from these important places, these protected sites, to recolonise the wider landscape. And we know now as well that there's a huge value attached to the way in which the national environment, that nature provides a range of services for the economy, for society, for our health and well-being, that provides additional impetus about why we need to step up our game and increase the amount of available space for wildlife within that wider landscape. And we as the Wildlife Trust have called that creating a living landscape, one which is full of wildlife but also producing food and opportunities for recreation and for economic opportunities also. So I'll just use this thing here. So what we've tried to describe really is the fact that the approach that we've had to date, as important as it's been, still isn't working. We all know the facts, the figures around the State of Nature report that came out earlier this year, that there are continuing declines. We've got to reinterpret, rethink the way in which we do conservation. So this is an example of one of the living landscape schemes that the Wildlife Trust over in Montgomeryshire are working on, called the Plynlimon Project. It's up in the Cambrian Mountains. It's the source of the River Severn and the Wye. And rather than just looking at the individual nature reserves that the Trust has in that area, they're looking across a 40,000 hectare area within that Cambrian Mountain patch and thinking about the influences on that landscape and the way in which the natural environment at the moment in its degraded state is operating. And then thinking ahead, not that far ahead because that's right at the last slide. I'll let the people who are in charge of that deal with that. How we can actually, by operating at a landscape scale, think about the way in which that landscape could. Now somebody else is definitely playing with this. Sorry, this is really distracting. I've got slides spinning around in front of my eyes. I'll ignore that. How we can actually start to put wildlife back at the heart of the way in which that landscape operates. At the moment, that upland landscape is heavily grazed, it's heavily deforested, heavily drained. So what is the way in which, what are the other opportunities, what are the other choices that can be made within that landscape that mean that that particular area can be operating in a much more effective, healthy, functioning way? So once this comes back up again, you'll see the vision that they're working towards. So this is about choices. It's about thinking not just about the individual sites and standing on the edge of those sites looking in. It's about standing on the edge of our protected areas and looking out into the wider landscape. Now, what this means is that the way in which we monitor how those interventions are actually improving or not the case for wildlife presents us with some huge challenges, because we're looking across a much larger area and we're looking at not just how individual species and where they are in presence and absence, but needing to, as Bill said, bring together a whole range of other information that tells us whether our interventions are actually making a difference. Please work. Hey! So I'll use that button in the future. So this is what the trust. So I'm constantly learning. We're constantly learning, all of us, aren't we? So this is what the trust is kind of trying to describe within this particular patch. So this is about re-wetting. This is about reforesting in some elements. This is about taking some animals off, but maybe putting different animals back on again. These are huge interventions over a big scale. And the idea is that not only will this benefit wildlife, but it will also have benefits for flood risk management, for water quality, to stop people within that imaginary conurbation ending up to their knees in water in their living rooms because the water has flowed too quickly off of the mountains. But this presents us with huge challenges in the way in which we gather data and interpret it. So I've already mentioned a little bit about why we're taking this approach. And really what it boils down to is that, in answer to a question earlier around the protected areas, is that although those areas will remain valuable, and in terms of the Lawton Review and the Lawton Report, they are our core areas, they're not enough. And I think that there's a kind of a realisation, and a growing realisation, that those protected areas are needing to be kind of rethought in the way that the role that they play within the wider landscape, rather than individual sites and protected areas for that particular feature. It's what is the role of that particular priority habitat or protected area as part of a wider ecological network. The fact that the soils within that protected area will have been undisturbed for potentially centuries, holding a really valuable seed bank. And I think that the way in which we view those sites within this wider landscape scale approach is really critical. So we're not just retaining a minimum viable area. We're being much more ambitious about putting wildlife back on the map. And this is now supported in government policy. Before the last general election, we were pushing government to publish a natural environment white paper in order to set out the government's ambitions for restoring the natural environment. And we now have that. As Barry mentioned earlier, we have the National Ecosystem Assessment, which for the first time ever in the world tries to give a value to what the natural environment provides us. And we have the Lawton Review, which is now being widely used to describe this landscape scale approach to conservation. But how these then evolve and are used, how this feeds into other policy, how it feeds into the targeting of agri-environment funding or Water Framework Directive funding, is still to be seen. So I'm going to get onto my knowns now, having kind of talked generally about the overall approach. So I'll start with the positive as well, with the knowns, is that we've already had a number of people today saying that we've got this whole army of people out there, due to their hard work, we've got a huge amount of data, huge amount of records about where particular species are or have been or aren't, importantly. But what we also know is that there's if you like, a complex ecosystem of recorders. No recorder is the same. No recorder has the same preferences. No recorder necessarily stays in the same place. People move around. So there's this and have their own biases. So there's this complex ecosystem of people out there who have got varying levels of skills, varying levels of knowledge, and various levels of interest. And recorders in themselves are pretty rare species in comparison to kind of maybe politicians. So there are a really small number of people who are being asked to do an increasingly large amount in order to meet these huge challenges that we're setting out in terms of understanding how our wildlife is responding across large landscape scale activities. We also know, and I won't dwell too much on these, that the natural world's in a bad shape. And that there are many success stories, such as the otter returning to every river in England, but there are also many more declines. So we need to also kind of not rest on our laurels and think that there are certain species that we've dealt with and we know about. Water vole, we published some work recently as we managed the National Water Vole Database project, that showed that water vole presence and absence, or their presence, has declined by 22% over the last 10 years. So this is huge shifts, and this is a hugely charismatic species, which you would have thought we would be right on top of, but there is no national monitoring programme for. So we've got knowns in terms of particular species, particular highly recorded, popular groups of species. We know that much. We've got some good stuff on particular sets of species. But we're also kind of struggling to get to grips with some of the less recorded groups. In terms of the unknowns, we've got a lot of unknowns around how wildlife will respond in the future. How will wildlife respond to increasing development threats, to climate change, to changes in water availability and water quality? So we don't know quite how wildlife's going to respond. And we've got some charismatic species, I mentioned the water vole, where we've got lots of information, but still, even for those, there's a big unknown. The other really huge unknown is the whole way in which we understand ecosystem functions and ecosystem services, and the role that particular species play in delivering those services. If you go back to my illustrations about that particular vision, and the managing flood risk, the managing water quality, etc., what is the role of particular key species in delivering those particular services? Also, is there really the clarity on the real priorities? What are those species that we absolutely need to record? What are the kind of the landscape scale species, if you like, that give us real indicators of the way in which the landscape is changing? Are enough people aware of what those priorities might be? Even if we set them, are people aware of that real desperate need and where those priorities lie? And are there then not only enough people that know about it, but enough people who are skilled, trained, knowledgeable, and actually care enough to go out there and actually gather that information? And that's a huge unknown. But in some ways, we can't be paralysed by that. We can't be paralysed by the lack of knowing the exact way in which to monitor those ecosystems, the way to monitor the species change across that whole landscape. We've got to get on with it. So in order to know whether we're securing nature's recovery, we've got to think about how we monitor at a site scale as well as a landscape scale. In that case, we've got to know some real important baselines, either on those protected sites or features within that landscape. And we've got to accept that regardless of our interventions, regardless of the best conservation strategies, there are going to be winners and losers, but we can't pick those at this point. So we've got to be, in trying to use our very limited resources, we've got a huge challenge about where those should be targeted in order to make sure that things aren't falling through the sieve. So in terms of our need to knows, I think really in terms of our conservation strategy going forward, this landscape scale, if you like, ecosystem approach, we've got to understand what's driving landscape scale change. And I think going to Bill's point around this platform, is it's really critical that we are able to analyse those multiple sets of data in order to really understand what's happening within a particular given area around kind of environmental conditions, water quality, where the wildlife is and where it isn't. And we've also got to understand then what the best practice conservation activity is in order to deliver the change that we want to see in that landscape. So how do we improve the way in which we share information about which conservation interventions are actually having the best desired result in terms of the conservation outcome? And we haven't quite cracked that in terms of the way in which, as organisations, we share information about what we're doing on our particular sites, the advice that we're giving to farmers and landowners, the advice that we're giving to local authorities, to know which of those different things are actually having the best effect. And then the whole debate which is now starting around this spectrum of intensive management on one end to rewilding at the other. We've got to think really within that spectrum, what are the really critical things that we need to do and what would be the nice to do's, but actually if we focus on the nice to do's and not the need to do's, then our conservation strategy won't succeed. So in order to make sure that we're filling some of these gaps, it's really critical that we are connecting the recorders with the conservation activity, with the conservation academics to really test these different theories of landscape scale conservation so that we can really understand what it is that's making the difference for wildlife. And we've got to accept an uncertainty at the same time. As Bill said, we won't have perfect knowledge, but we've got to kind of trust our gut instinct that actually this landscape scale approach is the best approach that we have in the toolbox at the moment, but we need to constantly be refining and evolving that. And this is about new partnerships. It's about organisations working much better together to share that information. And really it's about that appliance of science. It's about making sure that our people out on the ground have access to the information coming through the universities, coming through these various research projects and studies that can then be directly applied in the way in which we set our mowing regimes or our woodland management plans, for example, and not just be using the 20, 30-year-old kind of programs that might have been appropriate at that point, but not necessarily appropriate now in this kind of increasingly dynamic systems. Bill's already mentioned the digital drive and the digital age and the way in which this is freeing up people to actually record and to send in their information through a multitude of different ways. But the really critical thing about this is about a lot of what I've said so far is about putting wildlife back on the map, about having more wildlife in more places, etc. But the really important thing around all this is about putting naturalists back on the map. This is about having more naturalists, more people who are trained, who are supported, who are knowledgeable, who are out there on the ground, able to support others, to build capacity in that wider community of people who care and people who are interested in actually kind of telling people what they've seen. But we need to make that as easy as possible, and we need to be able to sustain that over time. The point earlier about the long-term monitoring programs is absolutely critical. We can't just dip in and dip out of this. We've got to sustain the effort over a long period of time. And perhaps some of these, some of the technological solutions can help us to do that. One thing that we're working on, and we're developing this in partnership with the BTO, is to try and kind of answer, or to help answer, one of those questions about change at a landscape scale. And the system's called Wild Walks, and we'll be launching it in spring next year. But part of this system is to look at how you can get people to take an interest in a kind of repeatable way, whether they're walking their dog or walking their children to school or whatever it might be, or rambles around the countryside at the weekend, to actually tell us what they're seeing and those kind of on the walks that they're doing. It's about all taxa, and it's about making this an accessible thing for people to do. So really the final point, I guess, and it's hopefully a really positive point, is that nature does matter, but the importance of our understanding, the importance of knowledge of nature is absolutely fundamental. I think it was Barry that said earlier that our future economic prosperity is dependent on our biodiversity prosperity and our biodiversity wealth. If you really take that seriously and believe that our wildlife and our wild systems and our knowledge of that underpins our society, underpins our health, our well-being and our economy, then surely the critical information about where that wildlife is and how it's faring is fundamental to our society as a whole. So we need that data, we need that evidence, and we need to collect it in a sustained and a structured way. We've got to respond to the changing conservation environment, this landscape scale, and broadening out our interests beyond individual species into those wider environmental quality concerns. But we've also, if we're going to stimulate that recording and achieve nature's recovery, we've really got to up the ante in terms of inspiring and stimulating people to show an interest and to get out there and tell us what they're seeing. And I think some of that will require greater investment in support, in training, and in making the systems much more straightforward for people to use, but also providing people with the inspiration and interest to actually look around, look at what's changing within their patch, and at a really local and personal level, show that commitment to this, to making this kind of recovery happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Is there time for one or two questions? Yes, Jonathan.
Since platform has been mentioned a couple of times, I'd like to make a comment. I could phrase it as a question, but frankly it's a comment about that. People with much more money than us have fallen flat spending hundreds of millions on failed big data projects. The NHS data project, BBC spent 100 million. So I think that we ought to think differently about how to join things up. And there is an alternative to having a platform, which is to use something called open link data, where basically all the different platforms make their data available to everybody and make it searchable. And amazing things can happen when you do that, I think. So before we spend a lot of money, we don't have a lot of money, but before we look for a lot of money to spend on a path that others have trodden and hasn't gone anywhere, I suggest we think a bit. I completely agree, work with each other, but it actually has to do that has to be reflected in how the data architecture is organised as well. And not a big platform.
Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much again. The next talk is by Ed Mackey from Scottish National Heritage, and his talk is entitled 2020 Vision, Emerging Needs and Priorities. Ed.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm Ed Mackey from Scottish Natural Heritage. I head the Knowledge and Information Management Unit, and my responsibilities are very much around the collection, management and use of information. What I would hope during this talk is that we might pick up one or two of the threads that have preceded us in the talks that have gone before. One of which, the photograph, of course, of the Burnett moths here. But in terms of these three areas of work, we talked about collection of information. How much information do we need? What information is it? Where are our priorities? In information collection, there is a certain amount of inertia. There is, we do it this way because we've always done it that way, and we repeat. In times of austerity, we have had to reconsider this and think, is what we're doing and what we've done in the past really fit for purpose? Does it meet the requirements now and into the future? In terms of information management, are we securing our information in ways that make them accessible for use and can be maintained into the future? And in terms of use, there are a variety of different types of use, and they apply at different spatial scales. We've heard some of this in the previous talks. Part of my talk will be at the national scale, but of course when we come into biodiversity action, we want to look at appropriate local scales, particularly the catchment scale. In the keynote address, Barry Gardner asked us, what's the value of a mountain? And of course, in ecosystem service terms, it's very high. Mountain is also a metaphor for a problem. And famously, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, two approaches were taken to trying to remove the problem. One was to ignore it, to cloak it behind an SCP field, it's someone else's problem. And the other one, at last minute, when it was far too late, was to try to remove it by digging it out. In our context, looking to 2020, perhaps the approach we want to take is maybe to try and climb the mountain and see what the view looks like from the top. And of course, globally, there's a consensus through the Convention on Biological Diversity, the strategic goals that have been set out, and the 20 targets that we're working to collectively at a global scale. Where did this all come from? Why are we doing this? Well, we had experience before of implementing biodiversity action. And in 2010, we made an assessment of how successful we'd been. At the global scale, it was determined that the 2010 biodiversity target to slow biodiversity loss hadn't been met, and that in fact pressures on biodiversity continue to increase and biodiversity to decline. Similarly, at the European scale, the 2010 assessment showed that biodiversity services were degraded, and that was reflected in the status of species across Europe and decline noted among, in this case, animals. The UK itself, of course, undertook the 2010 assessment, and the picture here showed similarly a large proportion of the indicators that were used to assess whether the targets had been met showing deterioration, although a substantial proportion, almost a third, again showing improvement. And we saw that in the previous talk there. It's not all bad news. What's noticeable here perhaps is in terms of long-term assessments, there was notable knowledge gaps. We just weren't able to assess success. And there's been some closure in the shorter term in terms of starting to fill these knowledge gaps. In Scotland, and I will be referring to some extent to Scotland because the environment being a devolved responsibility, we're accountable to the Scottish Parliament, and therefore we're particularly interested in information at that spatial scale. We work within the United Kingdom. A lot of the information that we use is collected in partnership throughout the United Kingdom and in Great Britain, but ultimately we do want to report it at Scotland and at appropriate scales within Scotland. And we undertook our own comprehensive assessment, 2010 assessment, and part of the evidence base for that was a series of indicators, and it contains good news like the otter. Similar to England, the otter was virtually excluded from the Central Belt, the former industrialised and most densely populated Central Belt in Scotland. And over recent decades, since the 1970s onwards, it's largely recolonised its natural range. Now, when I was growing up in Glasgow, I can well remember the filthy state of the rivers. I can remember the dereliction. I think I would say in my lifetime, I've seen enormous environmental improvements. We still need to be conscious of the task ahead of us, but there have been major advances in environmental improvement, particularly in tackling gross pollution of our inland waters. Another example might be the expansion of more natural native woodland. But again, it's a mixed picture, and we concluded that where targeted action had taken place, there were notable improvements, but overall, like the rest of the world, the 2010 target hadn't been met. Passing along the way, we might try to draw one or two conclusions from this. And the conclusion here really goes back to the original Rio Declaration. We're not in this alone. The types of issues that we see at a country scale, at a national scale, European global scale. They're all rather similar, they're all rather reinforcing. And so we have a global context for this. And we have a duty to act locally. We can make a difference. If we are not doing it, can we expect others to? Could we even set an example of good practice and show within our own borders what can be done? So translating these three lines of work that I'm involved in, the questions that I'd like to look at are, what's the strength of our evidence? Do we know enough? Do we know the right things? Importantly, is it accessible to those who need it? It's no good if it's hidden away, if we can't get at it. And ultimately, is it being used in productive ways to actually improve the world around us? So I'll start off with the evidence. Here we come back to the European 2010 assessment. And at that time, the Habitats Directive, these are habitats and species considered to be of most importance for conservation across Europe. The position wasn't very good. In large part, they were not in favourable condition. And furthermore, there was a knowledge gap. And the knowledge gap, as we've seen for the marine environment, of course this is terrestrial, freshwater and marine, concerns these sorts of parameters. The extent of habitats, the abundance of species, their range. More difficult perhaps is trying to assess their condition, determine what is causing declines, and what future prospects are, how we might respond to that information in terms of improving the situation. Now at the European scale, the top priority, and this is reflected through all environmental policies, are the directives. So we have the Habitats, Birds, Water Framework, Marine Strategy Framework Directive, all moving in a consistent way towards environmental improvement and securing biodiversity. And in the United Kingdom, we have 89 species and 77 habitats listed in the Habitats Directive, for which we have European responsibilities. The other directive down here, Inspire, is about data standards for interoperability. And this is, if we think about the problems we have within a nation, about the difficulties of communicating and interacting, this is multiplied many times across the European Union when it comes to trying to assemble a coherent picture of what's changing, making it accessible and putting it to productive use. Usefully, on the NBN, we're able to filter in the designation categories here. We can now filter on species listed in the Habitats Directive. And here's a component of this. Annex 4 species are the European protected species. That means that they are protected throughout the range across Europe. Example of that earlier was the otter. So it's a very important species. It's a conservation success, and it has a special status in terms of our responsibilities for it. So what we might say about this category of species is that it's important. iRecord provides improved ways of recording to bring in more recorders, find it easier to collect records. For these European protected species on Annex 4, there's also a requirement to record incidental capture and kill. This is where perhaps a cetacean is caught up in bycatch, or an otter is killed on the road. So we're in discussion with JNCC and NBN about how we might add this additional information into the recording of these European protected species. And another important category is invasive non-native species, in which we want to identify them as quickly as possible, record them, so that action can be taken. Here's the opening screen on the JNCC website for the recently published Habitats Directive report. Now, it's published, it's publicly accessible, it's open and transparent, and for the first time in this reporting round, all of the species data that were used in the reporting were first put onto the NBN, so that we have a clear accountability and audit trail and security of information that contributed to the assessments in this report. Now, we've heard in earlier talks about the problems of getting access to information and some of the restrictions that are placed on getting hold of it. But in principle, I would hope that we can start moving towards a position where all species data should be made available through the NBN, accepting that the contributors can then put on conditions about access. They may need permission to use. They may want to generalize the output scale for general use. But it's important to have everything in there, because it tells us what we know, and it reveals to us what we don't know. And in a report like this, the days of searching around and doing specific searches for different purposes really are diminishing. There's still a lot of data out there that's not in accessible forms. We put a lot of effort into this report to make sure that the species records were put onto the NBN. That work is still underway, and it's our view that for our purposes, the route to species data should be the NBN. Here's part of this Article 17 report, the Habitats Directive report. Amphibians and reptiles. And one particular one that we'll have a look at is great crested newt. It's on Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive, meaning that special areas of conservation need to be designated for protected areas. But it's also on Annex 4, meaning that it's protected throughout its range. And in the directive, we're not just talking about protected areas for any of the species. We have to know their status wherever they occur, on sites, but also more widely, land, freshwater, and sea. And there's a UK report for this, but also it was built up from country accounts. And this is the first time again that this has been done for directive reporting. And this is very important to us. Here is an extract from the report. It's the distribution map for great crested newt at 10 kilometre square scale. And for most visualization, that's probably adequate. For many purposes, this is perfectly adequate to see what the distribution is. But when we look at some of the detail, we start to see that there were data limitations. Comprehensive data is not available. It's widespread in England and parts of Wales. It's less so in Scotland. And that extract is taken straight from the NBN, because we made sure that the available data were put onto the NBN, and so it could be extracted and everyone can get access to this. So NBN provides excellent mapping. What I'll be talking about a little later is some of our thoughts about more intuitive access to it, not necessarily through NBN, maybe through developments at the user end. So here is the picture in Scotland, not quite so widespread as in England. It's at the northwestern edge of its European range in Scotland, and as we've seen, it's poorly represented by survey. So why is this? Well, it's a charismatic species, but it's not a particularly easy one to record. It requires some specialized equipment, and where disturbance is involved, that, because it's a protected species, requires licensing. But as we've seen in Bill's talk, there are new opportunities opening up. For example, in environmental DNA, collecting water samples rather than doing direct observation. And this has been proven for a number of taxonomic groups. And in fact, there's a report shortly to be published, coordinated by JNCC, involving the country agencies, which assesses the potential of eDNA for the first time throughout the national range of a species. And it concluded that it's more effective than traditional survey methods, which are a bit hit and miss and difficult to undertake. It's faster, requires less skill, and has a lower error rate. It makes a national surveillance survey feasible for the first time. Now, as a non-specialist, I might be quite happy to be instructed on where to go to collect water samples. Maybe not all volunteers are going to want to do this if it's the amphibians that they want to go out and look at. So here in Scotland, this is odd because we've got the main distribution in central Scotland and to the south, and here's an outlier up around Inverness. Now, it's always been questioned what's the status of these newts up here. Perhaps their introductions, they have lesser conservation importance than the native great crested newts. But again, a study has been undertaken of those. Through DNA fingerprinting, they've been compared with the reference populations in central Scotland, and it's been concluded that they are indeed native, and there may be subpopulations within them, to the Scottish Highlands. So there's 80 kilometres of inhospitable habitat between them. Those are isolated, distinctive native populations, and it's also been shown that these are unreliable historical records or introductions. So is the information accessible to those who need it? Well, through the NBN it is. In Scotland, we were talking about this problematic issue of mapping. This is a screenshot from Scotland's Environment website, the gateway to everything you want to know about Scotland's environment, and this will lead us on to the concept of a platform. How do we start to assemble the information that we want to start to look at in combination to draw conclusions? And a component of this is basic mapping. This is our current capability for mapping species from the NBN. It's taking a web feed and it's simply producing a density map, in this case at 1 kilometre square resolution, of all species that are coming out of the NBN. So we've had given some thought to what actually we need to know, what we need from the NBN. And usefully, NBN provides filtering according to 5 categories: taxonomy, designation, date, dataset, and geography. But it doesn't provide the easy access that we would be looking for. So there are specific requirements that we would want in terms of the types of data set that we want to have quick access to, so that we can select, I want to know about ecosystem health, and it will select those species that have been identified as indicators of ecosystem health that we want to look at the catchment scale straight away, and combine that potentially with others, or pollinators, say, at different geographical scales and different spatial geographies. And then we want to be able to analyse this. So the discussions we've had with Jeff Johnson, NBN, and with our own specialists is how to do this. Should it be built into NBN? Possibly not. Or should it be built at the user end? So we're now looking at how we could take standard NBN outputs and start to build in this functionality. And the answer to it may be linked data, treating it as linked data rather than conventional databases. And in terms of the platform, going beyond the conventional mapping approach, we're now thinking about developing a land atlas, a more interactive way of looking at spatial data in combination, and starting to combine these policy information needs rather than the conventional sort of land cover species, going beyond that into components of natural capital, defining ecosystems and ecosystem services spatially, for example. Here's a map of Scotland showing recognition of natural heritage importance. Now, 18% of Scotland is designated for nature. It's within protected areas, the land area. This is land and sea. This is simply the land component. Also, through ownership by conservation bodies or public bodies with a conservation remit, there's an element of security there, or recognition of natural heritage importance. Through our rural development programme, there are management agreements in place with conservation objectives, and importantly, local authorities zone land which are, have a conservation attribute. It might be a local nature reserve or national or national scenic area. And altogether, 4% of Scotland on its land area is of recognised natural heritage importance. And the colours here are simply 4 reinforcing levels of recognition. And if we look at that map, it starts to correspond with other maps that we produced, for example, for high nature value characteristics. So what can we say? Is this effective? We need to have some way of undertaking improved integrated spatial analyses for biodiversity action, ecosystem characterization. What are the mechanisms to safeguard biodiversity? Are they effective? So work that we're undertaking in Scotland, including the ways in which we want to make use of NBN data, focus around this integrated spatial analysis. So finally, what influence does it have? Well, we heard reference to the State of Nature report recently published. Threats are many and varied. And it says that conservation action is hampered by a lack of knowledge on trends. the recently published UK biodiversity indicators. One of our strongest data sets is birds, and that's true across Europe as well. So I'll just take this by example to follow through this use of information. And famously, of course, a long-term decline in farmland birds. Here's a component of this for Scotland, our terrestrial breeding birds, and there's a farmland component to this too, starting to show a dip off. Now, how do we use this information? Well, it's okay in context. Yes, it tells us something about our these species, but what can we actually do about it? This has to feed in somehow to informing action under the Rural Development Programme. That's the funding mechanism that can actually do something about it. And here we have an example for a subset of those farmland birds, the seed-eating birds. So we need to know something about them and their habitat requirements. We've done some further work and modelling on those seed-eating birds for which we have sufficient data, and we can start to show their trends at a regional scale, in this case at the 100-kilometre block scale. Now, the work that David Roy's leading on in BRC on biological recording, analysis and interpretation is doing this more extensively for NBN records, making sure that we make best use of NBN records to undertake trends analysis that are robust and reliable. So that's a major advance on the use of the data. One of those components under the Rural Development Programme was hedgerows. It's the greatest adoption within that programme has been hedgerows. We don't have a map of hedgerows. This is a representation of landscape character for hedgerows. So there's an issue about being able to map structural features in the landscape. And finally, when we're talking about habitat, what do we mean? We've got a long history of mapping habitats. We have national schemes, we have local schemes, we have the Countryside Survey. Countryside Survey 2000, 2007. If you start making comparisons, you quickly realise that the inconsistencies between the two approaches, different methods, different spatial frameworks, different classifications, means that they each individually provide one view of the world, but they don't provide a way of comparing 2000 with 2007. We've spent a lot of effort among the conservation agencies in collecting very detailed botanical data on the National Vegetation Classification. And because it's so expensive and difficult to collect, and indeed difficult to interpret, this has been largely restricted to protected areas. So what we're moving towards now is a standardised classification based on the European classification for interoperability under Inspire, and to give us a standard that we can then use across our policy areas. Summing up, we reached 10 possible conclusions. In Scotland, we are working with NBN to promote the profile of NBN and the use of it in this project under the Scotland's Environment website. And in terms of providing a more strategic overview, a forum for the local recording communities and local record centres, we have a biodiversity information forum that enables us to interact at a level that provides greatest benefits to the recording community and ourselves. So, thank you very much. Thank you, I saw.
There's time for one question. Yes, at the back there.
I've heard several times today this environmental DNA phrase, and I have some concerns based on the forensic route. I presume it's being considered because it would be a cheap way of giving you presence and absence.
Yeah.
But in the same way as the analogy you gave, people like to go to ponds to survey for great crested newts. Presumably, you stand the chance of actually surveying for stuff that's been carried there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, what we lack is a reliable base map of where they're present. And then this would open up the possibility for more detailed study. But what the environmental DNA allows us to do is to get a clearer picture of their range and their extent.
But not an understanding of the provenance of how that DNA got there.
Are you suggesting that it could have been translocated?
I think there is evidence of that happening within certain invertebrate groups. People trying to put on Breen Down, there's colonies of Glanville's fritillary that come up every couple of years.
Indeed.
I'm just wondering whether we're looking too much to technology.
Yeah. The issue there is mainly getting a clear view of where they're present so that they can be taken into account in development planning decisions. And we don't have that knowledge. But as I showed in the case of Scotland, we are able to differentiate where introductions have taken place, so we can essentially discount those for now. It's the native populations that we're interested in. But if you're concerned about whether there has been an unofficial translocation, other methods would be needed or case history needed. And of course there are some official translocations to extend the range, because a great crested newt only has about a 1 kilometre foraging range. So if we're going to connect a series of interconnected ponds and habitat, then they may need to be assisted to move into uncolonised areas.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, the final talk this afternoon is by Sue Townsend and Richard Burkmar, and it's entitled Field Notes of a Training Provider, Joining the Dots for Biological Recording Training. Are you giving it as a duo or?
Yes, we are.
Okay, that's exciting. Good, thank you.
We promise not to dance. Good afternoon, everybody. I promise I won't keep you too long for your tea. And being the last one up means that I've got to be specially stimulating, somebody told me, so I shall try my best. So bear with us. We work for an organisation called the Field Studies Council, which many of you may have heard of. And what we want to tell you about this afternoon is where we've come from, what we do now, our vision for the future, and how we intend to get there. So that's our plan. And what we'd like to do is to build that into our considerations of our challenges for us as an organisation, which neatly, we think, dovetail in with some of the challenges that the NBN are facing in this evolving landscape. So what I want to do is to draw out some of those points. Now, I'm hoping that some of you will know things about us. So this is what it really hinges on, because we think that this is one of the things that's driving us to the future, which is also, of course, challenging the NBN. Because we believe taxonomy as a discipline is certainly declining rather from time to time, and we think some of our skills base might be. And like the previous speaker, I'm not quite sure how much our DNA is going to substitute for some of these skills that we really need in the field. So I want to dwell on that a little bit as well. So where do we fit in all this? Well, to start with, we're relatively old, we're 70, which is quite good. In fact, we celebrate our birthday next month, which is something to celebrate. And there's some sort of coincidence on when we started, looking back to Bill's talk. We've got some far-reaching connections because in 2013, and we haven't quite got all our data in yet, but we estimate there's over 150,000 visitors that come to one of our centres throughout the country, and there are 7,000 contacts at other sites. And you may have heard of the Opal Project, for example, and there's other outreach projects that we do where we make contact with people, not just coming to us, we try to go to them as well. We operate through 19 centres, and we've got a head office as well, which really help us. And really, what on earth happened to start us off? Well, there was a perceived need, and we haven't talked much about education in the young, which I think is one of the challenges for the NBN and ourselves. And we started off because there was a perceived need that young people just weren't getting outside enough. Have we heard that before recently? The National Trust said that quite recently. So, 70 years ago, we said that as well. There was a perceived need to get young people out into the natural environment. And we started because there was a chance meeting from somebody who passionately believed that, and we heard a little bit about passion as well in earlier presentations today. And this school inspector thought that really people just didn't know enough about their organisms, and these school children, when they were asked about things, and he chose dogfish as an example, they didn't know they had tails. They didn't know they had tails because they were looking at dissecting specimens which were pickled, which meant by the time it got to them to save in the postage, they didn't have tails anymore because they'd never seen that animal in the real environment. To steal one of Paul's phrases, in 3D. So these children didn't get out there. They spent all their time, in this case, in labs, so at least they did some practical work, and some of that's gone nowadays. But there was a worry. The other part of the story of where we started was there was a National Trust involved. And the National Trust were involved because they had a building that they didn't know what to do with, and they were actually a little bit worried about it. And so we actually became the Council for Promotion of Field Studies because we used that building for our first ever field centre. But it was a chance meeting. And I think serendipity is something that we sometimes don't actually count for in this. And it's often quite a happy accident that some of these things happen. So that chance to see the real thing is what drove this organisation. And we have a strapline of bringing environmental understanding for all. But that's very much in a practical sense, that we want to get people out there and we want to see it. And that was it. And that was the first ever field centre. And I just wanted to ask you guys now, because it's late on in the afternoon, so I just wanted to have a bit of participation. Please, can you just put your hand up if you've ever been to a Field Study Council centre to your knowledge? Good grief. That's amazing. Could you put your hand up now, please, for me again, if you've ever used one of our publications, one of our identification keys? I didn't expect that. I expected a high amount, but it was barely nobody who put their hand up at one time, I think, which is quite incredible. So we must have had quite a reach when we're doing some of our work, which is reassuring. I should have taken a photograph out. I thought somebody's got it. But what do we do now? Has it changed from when you had your experience, whatever that experience is? We certainly still provide courses. We provide courses for anybody, really. But school groups, we believe, are important because we need to inculcate the next generation of field naturalists. But we do work with universities, professionals. If I call them amateur learners, it encompasses almost everybody. We do lobby government. We're not alone in this. RSPB lobby government, National Trust lobby government. And what we want to do is to make sure that government have a provision for out-of-classroom provision for schools, and indeed all of us, to learn more about our natural environment. We also run a whole series of environmental projects, and more later from that, because why we're going to do this double act is Richard's going to explain some of those environmental projects and how they fit in with where we want to go. And of course we produce identification publications, but you know that, so I'll move on. What you may not know is, what about our customer base? And if you look at that graph, and it is slightly dated, I'm sorry, because I couldn't get some verified figures, and you don't tell the auditors that, but at the moment, on the top scale there, those are the A-level students or equivalent. So they're the people who are in their last years at school, and that's the bulk of our business, and it has been every year since I looked at those graphs last, which was 2004 to 2011. It hasn't changed much for 12. For the next group down, the under 16s, that's that blue line. So you can see that the bulk of our work is with school children. But many of you may know us for that, or you may know us because of the identification courses or the identification publications we produce, which means that you came in some of those categories in the bottom. Why I've put that graph up is because we're just one of the environmental organisations working with people, but really it needs to be brought home to other people that it's got to be a sustainable business model in some way. And that sounds very boring, that sounds very sort of business speak, as we heard from our people this morning. But really it's got to be that. And we depend on those top ones because they pay to come to us. So that's why we've been going since for 70 years, because these people give us a contribution so we can pay our staff, so we can deliver the courses. And those school groups are incredibly important for us. Where we are, and you probably know most of our centres, and some of you may have been there at some time, and by the look of that show of hands, most of you have at least been to one of them. They're not all residential. Some of them are day courses, day centres. We have a small office, which was in Paul's flood zone, actually. That hypothetical thing on your diagram could well have been Shrewsbury. It's very close to there. And we also have 2 new centres. One of them's in Belfast, and somebody was just talking to me about that this morning in the Titanic Quarter. And the other one that we've almost acquired, we've just about signed the deal, is in Millport in the Firth of Forth on the Cumbright Islands. So we've got quite a far reach, and we are growing, and we like to consider us to be dynamic. So, what do we do now in terms of identification training? We've got lots of skilled tutors. We don't employ them full time because they wouldn't want to teach all those school groups. So a lot of those skilled identification tutors are here. One of them got an award today, for example. Well done. Congratulations, Stuart. So we have lots of people who actually work with us and enable us to run courses in identification. We can run them nationwide because we have facilities nationwide. You've seen the map. We do have a long-standing reputation. Somebody once told me it was for rotten food, but I don't think that's true anymore, honestly. So I think we do actually have a long-standing reputation. I like to say we've got a network of successful field centres, and our contacts are very sympathetic and very supportive, and it goes throughout the UK and increasingly overseas as well, but it's the UK where we're specialists. We do recognise that some of the training courses that we put on are not commercially viable. Many years ago, about sort of 6 or 7 years ago, not that long ago, I put on a course on springtails. It wasn't a commercial success. However, from that course, we did actually generate some amazing records and some germs of understanding about some of the soil mesofauna. We're going to run another course on springtails and mites. It took me a long time to find a mites tutor a few years ago. He was 86. That might tell you something as well. So it's not always easy to find people to contribute to tutor for us on those minority groups that we all know we're so data deficient on. One of the ways that we've supported that in recent years is by a project called Biodiversity Fellows, which Rich will pick up later, but really that's one of the key ones that some of you have asked me about today, that actually did manage to inject some funding to make those less viable courses actually viable. And to pay tutors, because those of you who know us will also know we don't pay very much either to make this viable. So our business model is sometimes on a bit dodgy ground. So we recognise that the UK identification skills base is patchy. We want to help to fill in some of those patches, to fill in the gaps. And part of that awareness is that we rely, everybody said this, all your data that we put on the NBN, so much of it is from the volunteer data set. So we need to support that volunteer community. Okay, so we support them by producing publications, but even the publications aren't necessarily economically viable. Some of them are. For example, if you look to the left, the fold-out charts that we've become increasingly famous for, that one was in partnership with the Natural History Museum. And that one we can now sell, and we can make a bit of a surplus, hurrah. The atlases, thank you for the funding. I see the BRC are here, but look at the partnership organisations involving in promoting that. It won't stand alone. Moving along a bit, freshwater bivalves. We've got the Museum of Wales, National Museum of Wales, there, and the Environment Agency. And then the very erudite publications in the end. If you're a real entomologist, you'll know about the Royal Entomological Society's handbooks, and you'll know about the Linsock synopses as well, vital in understanding more about those species. So it's a huge range of identification resources, many of which have been tested by your good selves under the Aid Gap banner, that aid to the identification of difficult groups of animals and plants project, which enables us to trial keys. And in this new electronic era, we're going to have so many more ways of presenting our keys, whether it's lateral keys, whether it's online, whether it's apps, whether we argue with it or not. It's going to happen some way or another. We're going to get an increased technological resource. And we're seeing changes already. There's a huge change in the competency of biodiversity skills offered by teachers and students, and we think it's declined over the last 50 years. We also see the commitment within schools and universities to whole organism biology is really declining. This may be driven partly by the research evaluation framework, for example, that means actually you don't necessarily get the funds you want to teach whole organism biology unless you have a lot of high-class papers coming out of that. Linked to that, we think, is looking at what we sell in our publications. It was a time when systematic monographs really led the way in FSC publications. In this year alone, 96% of what we've sold are the fold-out charts, not the Aid Gap keys, not the monographs. The current identification resource landscape is really changing. We've already heard this from Bill, we've already heard this from other people. We echoed that ourselves. That exponential growth in social media, the number of times we have a small Facebook page for one of our projects and people are posting things. They're going to iSpot. There's lots of different ways in which they can get their identifications confirmed by people. So where are we now? The challenges to biological recording as part of our business. One of the issues is our existing capacity, going back to that graph on school groups, the existing capacity is really project-led. If we get some funding, we can run some of those projects. Otherwise, sadly, we can't, and we're very limited to what small things we can do on site. With some of the courses that's promoted by our actual brochures just come out only last week. So those are our public courses, which some of you can see lying around the place. Strategically, I think you'll see. And letting the market prevail has actually led to some shift in the balance of the skills within our own staff, because the identification courses now don't take a big chunk of our work. It's mostly making sure they can do their geography coursework, for example. Can they do statistics? So we've had a shift in some of the stuff that we do. And that's really our challenge if we want to support biological recording, because we've got very much a schools-based marketplace within some of our centres. So that leads us to the next stage and our vision of what we want to do to support more biological recording. And we do want to work with as many players as we can, because we think that partnership is really important to take this forward. We do want to support that volunteer effort. Those bullet points in the centre, I think, illustrate some of the products that we think we can use, so we can provide resources and support for tutors, be it training courses, be it venues. We can deliver ID training ourselves, and we can do some mentoring. We can also develop more identification resources, increasingly electronic. And I'd like to consider more how identification leads to records, because it often doesn't. It often leads to somebody saying, oh, I know what that is, but do they get the next stage and submit it to the NBN, which of course is a way of completing that. So we need to review what we're doing to make sure that we actually do roll out some new resources and they are used, and that we can monitor the recording successes of what we do. And what I want to do now is to hand over to Rich, because what he'll do is take us through how we aim to get there. No, I haven't.
Plow on.
No.
Yeah, what I'm going to do over the next few slides is really just give you an overview of some of the biodiversity projects that the FSC has concentrated on in the last few years. So we've got a timeline up there from 2006. It goes all the way down to 2018. Because the current project that I'm involved in, Tomorrow's Biodiversity there at the bottom, is funded until 2018. But the other three projects up there, Biodiversity Training Project, Invertebrate Challenge and Biodiversity Fellowship, those projects are all looked after by Pete Baldman, who can't be here today, but most of the description I'm going to give you and the explanation I'm going to give you concerns those three projects, because that's where most of our recent experience in biodiversity projects comes from. But the important thing there, really, to take out of that slide is that continuity of project work. If you think back to that slide where Sue shows you where our customer base is, you will have got the idea that as an organisation, we have to service our customers, we really have to put a lot of machinery and structure and thought into those school children, because that's what keeps this charity going. But as an organisation, we also have this tremendous ethos in biodiversity training too. And the only way at the moment in this current climate we can keep that going is through externally funded project work. And we have to try and link those together and keep it going. This, for me, is the most amazing project. So this is a project led by Pete Baldwin. It's still got another year to run, but it's already delivered an amazing amount. And if I can draw your attention to that second bullet down, this project has already produced 10 new county recorders. For me, that's an amazing figure. 10 new county recorders of invertebrates in Shropshire. I mean, how did he do that? I mean, Pete must sleep so well at night, you know, thinking what he's achieved over such a short period. And 4 of those have come from a base of knowing nothing about those taxonomic groups. And they started, many of them, with the biodiversity training project, which preceded the Invertebrate Challenge, and that reached out to a lot of people. That it was almost about engagement as much as it was detailed taxonomic training. But it made a fertile bed and a kind of audience for Pete when he started up this next project, Invertebrate Challenge, which was very detailed taxonomic training, getting people in and in, back and back again, the experts in to train them, but also it wasn't just about training, it was about networking, mentoring, and giving them a focus for their projects. So out of it is also going to come 5 new atlases for Shropshire. So this is an amazing output for one project. These people all coalesce around common goals. They meet once a year, and it's regularly attended by 70 people over 3 or 4 years now at Preston Montford, all getting enthusiastic about entomology. Some of those 10 new county recorders weren't new to their taxonomic group. Some of them were actually experts, but they weren't county recorders. And it was the networking that sometimes gave them the confidence and the support to take that extra step and fulfil that role as county recorder. They didn't need the taxonomic training, but they needed the other things provided by that Invertebrate Challenge project. And I think it's a brilliant model that we could, or nationally, we should think about reproducing that in other parts of the country. And I'm really keen, and I think Pete is too, that he writes something up when he gets towards the end of this project, maybe for British Wildlife or something like that, with some of the lessons which we're still digesting. You know, we're still amazed by the success of this, really. We've still got to digest why it's been such a success. And when we know that, we want to share it more widely. This is the Biodiversity Fellowship project, which a lot of you will know about, because this is the one that's been delivered this year, and it is still an ongoing project. It's not quite finished yet. I think it officially finishes early next year. But most of the training courses, 75 courses, have been delivered. There's just a couple left to do. Now, this is very different from Invertebrate Challenge, because the funder said, here's the money, we've got to have it delivered within 12 months. So it's right about diving straight into the training and doing a lot of courses and trying to engage a lot of people. We didn't want to forget that lesson that we'd learned about Invertebrate Challenge, which was that it's more than just about the ID training. It's about the support. It's about what happens when they leave the classroom at the end of the day. How do you get them coming back? How do you get them to submit records? How do you get them to engage with the recording schemes? So we haven't forgotten that in the Biodiversity Fellowship project, but there's no, well, currently anyway, there's no funding for us to continue that project next year, so we have to find ways of rolling the interest and the support from all those people that have engaged in that project forward into our other projects. I mean, this is the first project, really, where we've used social media quite extensively to engage with people. We've done it in a very experimental way. We didn't have a big strategy, but we thought we'll have a Facebook group, and the Facebook group took off. People liked it. Pete did a lot of tweeting to promote the courses, and that worked as well. So we're sort of dipping our foot into that method of mentoring and support as well. These are just some of the early figures of feedback from people. We put out an online questionnaire and asked people that had attended, well, that were registered as biodiversity fellows to give us some feedback. Now, I should have said 450 odd people registered as biodiversity fellows. Only 250 odd came on courses. That means there were 200 people that couldn't attend courses, but they saw value in registering as a biodiversity fellow, and I think that's an important thing. It's about membership and self-support as well as the actual training courses. So we got feedback from this online questionnaire of about 150 people, and 116 of those had actually attended courses. So we haven't analysed this feedback in detail yet. I'll be interested when we do to see what the people got out of it that registered as biodiversity fellows but haven't yet been on a course. That'll be interesting to see, because I think there are some positives in there in it for them as well. But of 116 respondents who actually attended a course as well, you can see the overwhelming view was that the courses had helped improve their identification skills and their skills and their ability to submit records. And when we asked them to estimate how many additional records they'd created in 2013 so far, as a result of their involvement in the courses, the total of those people comes to over 13,000 records. And currently, only 64 of those had entered records. And if you average that over those people, that's over 200 records per person. So, and that's just in 2013. The thing hasn't even finished yet. If we can carry on, keep that support going and that enthusiasm, it's going to generate a lot more records in the coming years as well, as long as we can keep those people engaged and developing. This slide is an overview of the Tomorrow's Biodiversity Project, which is the one that I've come on board in February to manage. This is a slightly different project. It's from a different funder. We've got more time to take a step back and think strategically about what we're offering. I should have said that the Biodiversity Fellowship courses were concentrated on under-recorded taxa, but it was simply a case of seeing what taxa were under-recorded from the NBN, for example, and asking the funder and the experts, and then seeing what trainers we could get to deliver training on those taxa, and bringing the two together. So it's very like that and let's do it, because we had to do it right away. Now with Tomorrow's Biodiversity, which also has a remit of training on let's say taxa that are under-recorded but will also have a part to play in the ongoing monitoring of biodiversity in the UK, we're looking at it more strategically. So we've got a couple of years up front to do consultation and research. So out of that, we should be able to find out which taxa are under-recorded, and from those, which ones potentially could have a role to play in monitoring biodiversity in the UK into the future. And then on top of that, which ones are we as an organisation, the FSC, best placed to make a contribution. And that contribution might be in training with ID, but it might be in training protocols, because it might be that a taxa isn't making a contribution to monitoring, not because of a shortage of ID skills, but because there isn't enough structured monitoring. And maybe, you know, in partnership with other people, we could help roll out that structured monitoring. So we're not prejudging this, and it could be because there are resources missing. And a big element of the Tomorrow's Biodiversity Project is to say what resources are missing to help monitor those taxa, and let's produce them. And we're looking at all sorts of resources. So the paper resources, which Sue has already talked about, but also multiple entry keys, which were mentioned earlier, app devices, etc., etc. We're being very open and broad and trying to get involved across all those delivery mechanisms. And the other big element is to take forward this idea, this big lesson that came from the Invertebrate Challenge project about mentoring and networks and plugging people into recording schemes of societies and filling those vacancies for county recorders, for example. So we really want to try and concentrate on that as well. So my last slide just kind of puts all those things together. It was about joining the dots, as you see. That was the title of our talk, and thinking about the contribution that we could make to help the NBN, the wider network, to meet the challenges of the future. And I put our projects in the middle there, or some of the work that we're involved in, and I was going to have them as dots with lines connecting it, but I used this graphic of these cogs, and I really like it, because to me, it shows how, for example, the Biodiversity Fellowship and the Invertebrate Challenge were really driven in the first place by the Biodiversity Training Project. It didn't just follow on, it actually drives it. And even though the Biodiversity Training Project is finished now, its legacy, what we learnt from it, the people, the audience we created, still drives those other projects. And where do future projects fit in? You know, when we put a new cog in this machine, we don't want to put it in a place where it grinds up against everything else and stops it. It needs to go in a place where it gets most torque from the other stuff, where it can contribute most torque to the other things as well. And you can think a bit about this in the kind of wider aspect as well, and start thinking about where does everything else fit in. And that's where we, the FSC as an organisation, think how we think about these projects. We have to think about projects when we think about biodiversity training for the reasons we've already told you. And when we think about putting a new one in there, we want to think about how can it lever most support from the structures, the cogs that are already out there, like the National Schemes of Societies, the NBN, iRecord, iSpot, and everything else. And also how it can support them. And that's why we really like this graphic. Now, the size of the different cogs don't really mean anything, I must say, nor does the positions. There are some missing. I mean, today I thought the consultants should be up there, but I forgot yesterday when I was doing this, so it's not up there. But they should be. The colours, on the other hand, are really, really important because the colours make that a really funky slide. And I hope most of you will be able to see yourself up there, and I hope you really like your colour. That's the end of my bit.
So just in conclusion, I hope what's come over to us, we've got a few beliefs in all that and a bit of passion that connectivity is important. I thought I'd just put a nice picture up just so we can focus. Not that cogs weren't lovely, but I think that what we need to think about is the people, because the people are the basis for all of this. So whether they're up there they're actually identifying mosses up there. So what they're doing is they're working out their MVC communities. Who cares? What it does is it typifies a field naturalist in action, and this is what matters. Their data was captured and it was put on our local record centre. And what we did with that data is feed it back to those volunteers so they could see what happened. And that's part of the cogs. So, but they're enjoying themselves. It's a lovely sunny day. They're up there. They've got passion and commitment and drive to do what they want. And we want to support these people. So we want to continue to support all field naturalists. We want to seek partners. So if you're out there and you've got a good idea, a couple of people came to me at lunchtime and said, would you consider? And the answer is yes, we'd always consider. So please come to us. We want to continue to promote field ID skills to all our, I've called them custom groups. I mean anybody who can benefit from this and provide more records. And we want to actively encourage identifications to lead to accurate records that we hope we're going to be able to share with the NBN and get those up there as verified records. So that's it from me. Thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. We've got time for one question, certainly, maybe two. Stuart, do you just? Oh no, you got a loud voice. You don't need a microphone.
Yeah, well, one of my hobby horses, training for trainers. That would be something that would be really, really useful.
I agree, Stuart, and it was something that actually came out of NFBR this year as well, something for us to look at to actually run a suite of courses for training the trainers. We already offer some of that, and as an associate tutor of the FSC, you're invited on an adult learners and techniques course, and we try and do first aid training as well, but I think it'll be really nice to bring that together as a forum, and it's something I'm looking at. So let's talk, because I think we could get that going.
Can I just add to that as well, that that could well be something that tomorrow's biodiversity project looks at, because as I said, we're open. We want to see what's required. Now, the first 8 months of the project has been about desk research, and there'll be some outputs for that published soon on our website that anyone can get at. But the next stage, which will really start next year, is consultation, and that's when I'll be wanting to talk to you and lots of other people to get these ideas and see what you feel as practitioners and people out there at Chalkface could really help you and really help us generate more people in that network of biological recorders. So, yeah, we'll definitely talk and take that idea on board.
One more question? Okay, well, thank thanks again very much. Well, the day's not over yet because there's tea and chat to come now. But just before we go, I do want to thank the speakers from both this morning and this afternoon. We've had a wide range of talks. They have all faced up to the theme of today, the challenges for data recording and the NBN. I don't think there have been any eureka moments, but the direction of travel and the problems that we've got to address over the next 2 or 3 years, I think are becoming increasingly clear. So could you all thank our speakers and contributors very warmly, please?